Bill Morgan in for Pam Cook on the Friday edition of Canton's Morning News. The Ohio State Buckeyes playing in college football's national semifinals coming up Saturday in Atlanta, and happy to be joined by the longtime voice of the Buckeyes, Paul Keels. Paul, we can ask you about the cliched keys to the game, but I think the one thing everybody is wondering about, how will this Ohio State defense play against a talented Georgia offense coming up at kickoff tomorrow night?
Well, hopefully better than what they did the last time they hit the field. It's a defense that certainly had shown some improvement, but they had a handful of plays against Michigan that once they got out the gate, it really kind of changed the game. So hopefully they won't have the issues with some missed tackling that occurred. They won't have the issue of getting caught with big plays, both running and passing. They'll be able to tighten some of those things up and just make adjustments that really were part of their overall improvement during the year, but that didn't show very well in the last game they played.
On the opposite side of the matchup, the Ohio State offense facing that Georgia defense. What do you see there, Paul?
Well, what we've seen when that offense has clicked has been an explosive passing game with what C.J. Stroud has done with his receivers as well as his tight end. But also what we're hoping we'll see more of is a sustained running attack. There were some concerns about Mayan Williams at running back, dealing with a little bit of a stomach bug during the week, but he got back later in the week and started practicing. So hopefully they'll be able to maintain some drives and really show some balance on offense, as well as protect C.J. Stroud. Ohio State was one of the best in the nation, but it came up only allowing 8 sacks a game, and that's going to be a tough order against a Georgia defense that's had 26 sacks and that has really been very, very disruptive.
Paul Keels, the voice of the Buckeyes, with us on Canton's Morning News today on 1480 WHBC. When we talk, Paul, about the matchups in the game, is there something that people may not be thinking about in terms of an individual matchup, a matchup of special teams versus this or that you think may be a key role in what happens on Saturday evening?
One of the things, Bill, might be the fact that Ohio State in their last 2 games had more than their fair share of penalties. They had 11 against Maryland and 9 against Michigan, and some costly ones in one in particular that comes to mind in the Michigan game. The Buckeyes had completed a pass, got a first down well into Michigan territory, but then things were negated because of a personal foul penalty. That's the thing that really look to see if they can't get that straightened out, because it's a bad trend. It was something they survived against Maryland, but it really proved to be costly against Michigan.
Paul, while technically it's not a Georgia home game, for all intents and purposes, it is. Do you think that'll play a role when things get underway on Saturday night?
Well, I think it will from the standpoint is that stadium, and I've never been in there, Bill, but from everybody I've heard that has been, it can get very, very loud. And, the ticket distribution is what it's supposed to be, but we won't really know what it is until game time. So it's safe to say that it probably will be more like a home atmosphere than, say if the game was played at the Rose Bowl or in Phoenix or something like that. But, Ohio State's had to play in tough environments before. Playing at Penn State is no easy task. So, hopefully it's something that their focus will help them offset it, but it stands to reason and to guess that it's going to be noticeably a pro-Georgia crowd.
Paul Keels, longtime voice of the Buckeyes on Canton's Morning News today on WHBC. Paul, when we talk about players that will be playing, you mentioned Mayan Williams, a little bit under the weather earlier in the week. Anybody else on a health perspective side that may be questionable going into the game? I know you don't technically find out about who that is, who may go until right before game time. Anybody on the radar that you and Jim have concerns about?
Well, I think the concern is lessened a little bit about Matthew Jones, one of the starting guards on the offensive line that was out in the Michigan game, but the indications are down here in Atlanta that he's going to be good to go. Other than that, Bill, nobody really else. Of course, obviously, folks by now know that Travion Henderson, the running back, will not play after having some foot surgery, and obviously Jackson Smith and Jigba, because of his injuries, has opted out. But at this point, nobody else that we're aware of that is of any major concern for the Buckeyes.
Paul, when we look at the Georgia offense, I think everybody's very familiar with their quarterback, who, like the Buckeye quarterback, a Heisman finalist. Who are some other key names on the Georgia offense that they'll be hearing you call often during that game?
Well, they have a trio of running backs that have been very productive: Kenny McIntosh, Kendall Milton, and Dejon Edwards. But the guys that are really dangerous threats are their 2 tight ends. Brock Bowers, who not only is a threat catching the football, but he's been known to run. He broke off a 76-yard run earlier this season for a touchdown against Kent State. And Darnell Washington, a huge tight end at 6'7", well over 300 pounds, and they create all kind of difficulties for opponents. Washington, more of a big, bruising, physical presence. Bauer's a guy that can do a lot more as a tight end in open space. So those are some of the names that'll be significant.
When you talk about those types of matchups, and we understand you're Paul Keels, you're not Jim Knowles, but how do the Buckeyes try and match up against two guys of that kind of a physical nature defensively?
Well, hopefully what they're able to do is the defensive line is able to at least create some delay for them getting into routes or getting into their favorable positions. And Bill, I think that's where that rotation on the defensive line hopefully and ideally can help. When you think of all of the people who have rolled through there, it's not just the familiar names of Zach Harris and Jack Sawyer and Jalen Tuimoloau and Teron Vincent, but there's so many others. Mike Hall, who at times has had some really impactful plays. When you think about Ty Hamilton, Tyleek Williams, Javonte Jean-Baptiste. So if those guys are able to create a little bit of a pressure from their initial snap, but those tight ends, really that comes down to a difficult matchup with safeties and linebackers. And with guys of that size, it's really difficult, but hopefully that's something that Ohio State will be able to have the right kind of protection for.
He is the voice of the Buckeyes, Paul Keels. And Paul, later today, whether it's a lunch or dinner and you and Jim Lachey are sitting around having a burger or a slice of a pizza pie down in Hotlanta and maybe an adult beverage, who will you guys talk about on the Ohio State side that has to have a big game for the Buckeyes to spring what, from a nationwide perspective, would be considered an upset?
Well, I think that starts with C.J. Stroud. And, Bill, we've been able to see for the last 2 years what kind of a special football player he is. The way he's passed the football. I mean, think about it. He's number 2 in career passing yards at Ohio State, number 2 in career touchdown passes behind J.T. Barrett. If he's able to pass the ball and add the added wrinkle of possibly creating a little bit of a running threat, then that helps give Ohio State a chance. C.J. Stroud has not been the runner that a J.T. Barrett was, or a Braxton Miller, or a Justin Fields. But if he can kind of create that kind of conflict for a defense, and if we can see Mayan Williams run the football the way he had 4 games of over 100 yards this year, monster game against Rutgers in which he scored 5 touchdowns and rushed for almost 200 yards. Those are the guys on offense. I think if they can play the way that they have at their top end, that really makes a big difference. But then after that, I think we got to look on defense at Tommy Eichenberg. He's had an outstanding season at linebacker, young man from St. Ignatius in Cleveland. If he can continue to play at the high level he has, those are the kind of things that really give Ohio State a chance.
And Paul, as we wrap up our conversation on WHBC, a purely selfish question from my perspective. I know when you guys go to some place you've never been before, and you mentioned you haven't been to where the game will be played on Saturday night, do you have any idea where your booth is going to be, as opposed to maybe right in the middle of the field when you're at home? Sometimes I know visiting teams are in bowl game situations. You could be down near the end of the field. Any idea if you'll face challenges in that regard on Saturday night?
My understanding, and the gentleman who does the Atlanta Falcons on radio, Wes Durham, is one of my best friends in the business. And my understanding, I think we're going to be down around the 5-yard line. So it won't be what we've seen in places like Phoenix or even in Miami where they have you in the corner of the end zone. So curious to see what it's like. But despite, wherever it'll be, we'll do the best that we can to try and describe what's going on as best as we possibly can.
Well, you guys always do, Paul Keels and Jim Lachey. And what I know is a crazy busy week for you, Paul. Thanks so much for making several minutes for WHBC on a Friday.
My pleasure, Bill. Glad to do it.